Well, advocacy groups have seized on the key theme of the G7 summit, gender equality and the empowerment of women, and say they won't be happy with more platitudes from G7 leaders. Many women's groups from Canada and around the world were invited to be part of the consultations leading up to the summit and to make recommendations for addressing gender equality, some of the things they would like to see to help build a better world and build a stronger worldwide feminist movement, a stronger role for women in the economy, on climate change, and on matters of peace and security and so on. Two of the women involved in a lot of those consultations leading up to the summit are with me today. Kate Higgins is the Director of Policy and Campaigns for Oxfam Canada. She's with me here in Ottawa. And from Toronto, we're joined by Paulette Senior, the President of the Canadian Women's Foundation. It's good to see you both.
Hi,
thanks for coming in to talk with me.
Thanks for having us.
Look, let's start with, I guess, the story that keeps developing here before we actually get into the theme of gender equality and women's empowerment. And that's the actions of the U.S. President Donald Trump and the trade fight he's now triggered. Paulette, let me start with you. How concerned are you that the discussions around tariffs and trade and the ongoing fights will maybe crowd out the other important discussions and proposals on gender equality and women's empowerment at the summit?
Well, you know, I did wake up this morning wondering about that and hoping that despite what's happening with the trade talks, that we'll still be able to have a strong focus on what I know was the Prime Minister's intent, is to have a focus on gender equality as President of the G7 this year. So I'm hoping that despite what's happening, that those issues can be discussed robustly, and that our Prime Minister will be able to, at the same time, be able to address the concerns of Canada as it concerns our economic future.
Kate, how concerned are you about that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're also very concerned about the implications of this for the summit, but I agree with Paulette on this. I do think that the Prime Minister in Canada has shown a strong commitment to gender equality, having that as a key theme of this G7 and mainstreaming it throughout all of the ministerial discussions has been a really excellent sign. The Prime Minister's appointment of the Gender Equality Advisory Council was a really strong step, and we do hope that that's something that can be institutionalised in the G7 processes going forward. So I do think there is a strong commitment. There's a lot at stake. Gender is really front and centre in this G7 process, and I do think that the Prime Minister and the Canadian government will remain very committed to pushing the G7 leaders to continue to really focus on this important issue.
I want to double track our conversation a little bit. I mean, we can look at the focus on domestic issues here and gender equality and women's empowerment domestically. Paulette, we can also look at it the way Canada is trying to lead this conversation about how to change things around the world. And again, with President Trump in the room, he sees foreign aid and how it's applied for issues involving women and girls a lot differently than many of the other leaders around that table. How do you think the Prime Minister, Paulette, should be dealing with that? You know, Donald Trump's view of how foreign aid should be used to raise up women and girls around the world, and how maybe some of the others, including Canada's Prime Minister, see it.
Well, you know, it's time for a different approach to make sure that gender is not seen as a fringe or sidelined issue. And I commend our Prime Minister for making this a central theme and topic of the G7. And I think that most countries around the world, whether in or outside of the G7, actually view Canada as a leader on this issue. And so the fact that he has taken this lead, my hope is that other G7 leaders will also be seeing this as important in their own national and global role to make sure that gender is central to part of what they are discussing and the decisions that they're making, and that furthermore, that those decisions have the critical gender-based analysis and lens that it deserves. I think it's for far too long that countries around the world have been absent of women's voices at key decision-making tables. And so what we who came together in Ottawa a few weeks ago through the W7, and I think joined by the members of the Gender Equality Advisory Council, what we're all saying together is that this needs to be central to how decisions are made, to discussions around critical tables, and that women's lives are critical to the economic security of the world. And leaving us out of those conversations is only detrimental to an entire country in terms of its economic outlook, but also women's lives are at risk, whether it's because of peace and security discussions, whether it's about climate change. We know that violence against women and girls has been an ongoing issue that hasn't been tackled the way that it deserves to be tackled. And so, you know, if leaders are really serious and committed to making a change in these issues, then it has to be part of the discussions. And furthermore, women must be around these decision-making tables for those discussions and other discussions, because I think I'd go further to say there is nothing that happens in this world, there's no decisions that are made where women's lives are not impacted.
So what should I mean, Kate, what do you expect to see if the summit's going to be a success in dealing with these issues? What does it look like? What do you want to hear from it?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, and you know, this week we have the development ministers and the finance ministers meeting for their ministerial in Whistler. Winnie Byanyima, who is Oxfam International's executive director, is there as a representative of the Gender Equality Advisory Council, and she's definitely asking the Canadian government and G7 leaders to step up on aid, to take Canada's lead. We have a Feminist International Assistance Policy that was a fantastic announcement of the Canadian government last year, and I do think that there is an opportunity for Prime Minister Trudeau, the Development Minister, the Finance Minister to really push other governments in this direction. I think it's very good news for us that we have France taking on the next presidency next year. President Macron has said that he is absolutely committed to continuing this commitment to gender equality. So I think that that's really important. I think another issue that we really need to think about is the structure of the economy, and that's what the finance ministers are talking about. It's going to be a big issue next week at the G7 Leaders Summit. And so a good outcome for us would be some really good discussions around the structure of the economy and how the economy is really rigged against women. Women dominate precarious jobs. They dominate underpaid work. They carry the huge burden of unpaid and low-paid care globally. So pushing that discussion, having discussions around that, I think will be really a really strong outcome. The G7 process is a process that continues year after year, and so we do want to see some big wins, but we also want to see kind of incremental changes, and the institutionalization of gender equality is a really key issue for the G7.
Well, let me ask you about that. So what does success from this summit look like to you?
Well, I think Kate has really said it. She's hit it on the nail. And I would go further to add that the fact that France is hosting next year gives us hope that this will continue not just in France but beyond. So what we hoped coming out of our W7 gatherings a few weeks ago was that this would be a model that could be carried forward in future G7 meetings, where women are coming together to identify what are the critical issues and what is it about those issues that need to be included in the discussions going forward, and that we can have significant impact in terms of the outcomes of these gatherings. So adding to Kate, I think that's the only thing that I would say is that we want to see that this is an ongoing structure of future G7 meetings.
All right. If that's what success looks like, Paulette, what does failure look like?
Well, as you start out this discussion, to me a failure would be a couple things. One is that the discussions are being dominated by the recent developments in terms of trade and the NAFTA talks. But furthermore is that this is ignored. So we don't want this to be ignored. In fact, 60 plus feminists and activists, women came together from the global north and south and from G7 countries and beyond to say that this is important. And it didn't take us very long to get on the same page in terms of what are the fundamental issues for women's lives that impact women where they live in communities around the world, and how the work needs to happen. So for me, it's that if this is ignored, it will, it's to the peril of the future of these issues for women. And I think it's about time that we pay significant attention to what we're saying as women who've been doing this work. There are significant dollars, for example, that's going towards international aid. And we want to see that international aid is going towards grassroots women's organizations that are making significant impact and know their communities best. Women know how to solve the problems that they're dealing with in their local communities.
And that's coming, a lot of that funding is coming from the Canadian side, $300 million. So, yeah, so let me finish with you then, Kate. What does failure look like? What's failure at this summit if they don't get to these important issues?
Yeah, let me add two things here, building on what Paula just mentioned. I think on the aid side, the foreign aid side, I think no commitment on foreign aid would be a failure. The government is committed to moving forward an agenda around adolescent girls, around education in crises, and I think we're really hoping that the Canadian government is able to mobilise resources in this space. So that will be a success. Failure will be if that doesn't take an approach that really has gender equality at its core and that doesn't really acknowledge the importance of women's rights organisations in delivering foreign aid and tackling gender equality. The other failure will be if we continue having this discussion around just adding women and stir and therefore we have women's economic empowerment. That's not how it works. We have a global economy that's rigged against women. It's rigged against poor women. So failure for me will be if we're not able to just move the needle a little bit on that conversation and really understand and have a conversation about structural changes needing to happen in the global economic system to make sure the global economy works for women, particularly poor women in this world.
All right, Paulette Senior in Toronto, Kate Higgins here in Ottawa. Thank you both for your time on this. Good conversation and gives us, tells us what to watch for when these leaders get together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Peter.